Hello. Okay, so this video will be covering globalization and its impacts on the economy. We'll be covering 4.1 first. So we define globalization, understand what it is, and we'll move on to some factors driving globalization in 4.2. Okay, so what is globalization? In a very broad stroke, I think this paragraph sums it up quite well. It's an expansion of the volume and variety of cross-border, etc. This is really the key idea of globalization. Anything that crosses borders is an aspect of globalization, right? Globe, right? The whole world. So you don't care which country transcending borders. But what is crossing the border? There are a few things that can cross borders. The first is your goods and services. So there's transactions of goods and services. And when we were talking about balance of trade, when we were talking about trade theory, your free trade or your protectionism, we were really looking at this box. Under globalization, there is an increased flow of goods and services, right? And this, you can also think of your final goods and services. But not only do we have final goods and services flowing across border, the intermediate goods and services, intermediate or your factors of productions also can cross borders. So capital is an important factor of production, and so is labor. Recall your factor of production is CELL, capital, entrepreneurship, land, and labor. And we have seen in recent decades that there has been huge flow of capital from one country to another and huge flow of people, right? You can think of it as short-term work permits or employment. You can also think in terms of immigration, where people move to other countries in the long term and they settle down in other countries. So that's also a very huge part of globalization. Unfortunately, the A-level syllabus will not have the scope to cover these two aspects of globalization in such great detail. So while you do understand capital flows and labor flows across countries, you need to link it to the ADAS model. And that's pretty much the focus of the A-levels. You don't have to understand the issues on its own with all the details and intricacies. Okay, so to sum up, basically globalization is a flow of blank across borders. What the blank is the type of things that flow across borders. So be it final goods and services, and so that's called trade of goods and services. It can also be the flow of intermediate goods, capital, labor. And if you want to expand this definition slightly, you can also think of the flow of raw materials, right? So the output of land. Entrepreneurship could also flow across borders. If you think in terms of ideas, culture, etc. Right? So the main idea of globalization is flow across borders, flow of what? And these are just some of the key items that we have captured that really transcends across borders. Okay, all right, let's continue with 4.2, factors driving globalization. You can think of any phenomenon, if it were to happen, there have to be two things, and the first is ability. So, what are some factors that enable globalization to be possible, that makes it able, right, for us to pursue globalization? And then the other aspect is willingness. What are some factors that will lead us to want to achieve globalization, or also on the flip side, to want to stop globalization, right? There are also arguments against globalization, right? So let's look at the first regarding ability. So far, the leaps and bounds in technological innovation and improvement in infrastructure is an important factor enabling globalization. So you think of the increased speed, reduced cost of transportation, right? And you can also think of the increased speed and reduced cost of telecommunications, without which these two items, without any of these two items, there will not be globalization on the scale we see it, right? So if you don't have transportation, how are you going to move the goods and services, the people, the raw materials? You can't move any of these. If you don't have communication, how are you going to communicate across countries? How are you going to liaise with your firms, with other governments, etc. and etc.? So these two are extremely important. Just to get a better visual idea, when I think of this improvement in technology, I think of in the past, when we had to move goods and services and people across seas, we were using a junk ship, right? Something like this. Junk ship, right? By the way, junk doesn't mean it's rubbish ship. That's really the name for this kind of ships. They're called junks, right? Okay. And today, where are we? We have huge container ships that look like this. There are a few football fields that can move containers like how many millions of tons at a go. And so really there's a huge improvement in the way we ship items, goods and services. Even if you want to think about how we ship people, such technology will be easily applicable, right? You can think of it as a cruise ship, or you can change from cargo. It can be many people. It's very easy and to go across borders nowadays. And of course, there's also the invention of airplanes. Right, so there's air travel for moving people across large distances. And then once the goods reach the port in the country, how do we move those goods? Well, in the past, we have the coolie, or maybe we have carts pulled by horses, right? But today, we have the semi-truck, and we have a huge way of moving goods and services, logistics. We have buses, we have cars, we have motorbikes, we have etc. To enable people to move across land, whether within the country or across countries, as long as the country is connected by land. And really, this is just a semblance of how transportation has changed, right? How about telecommunication? Well, some ideas that came to me were, in the past, we had this guy, our fellow trustworthy pigeon, where we would string our messages, insert text, and then feed the fella some food and fly. And then I don't know how they train the fella to fly to exactly where they want him to, or her to, but well, that's how they did it in the past. And soon after that, there was an invention, right, of the telegram, and they developed the Morse code, where they use a series of binary keys, so 1 versus 0, right? And then they have a combination of these to transmit a message. So here is this guy, operator. And then this is the machine. Then of course, the speed at which you can transmit information is a bit slow, although it could transcend large distances of time. And the telegram is really a huge development in technology, at least in those days. And then after the telegram, we've moved on to the telephone. And we are able not just to transmit binary Morse code, we are able to speak. So audio transmission, you can hear me as the way I'm delivering this message to you now. You are able to hear across countries, and that's great. And with the telephone here, you'll still realize that it is actually corded. So it's not very mobile, right? Then Motorola came along and developed the very first mobile phone that looked like a brick. And yes, by the way, this is the first mobile phone, and when it premiered, it cost like, what, almost $2,000? Yep, so, and in those days, you know, so you factor in inflation, how much the real value of this mobile phone is worth. Huge amount. But again, it's a breakthrough in technology. Now we have cellular connection. No longer are we bound by cords and by cables. We have satellites in the air that helps us to transmit messages across long distances, and it's mobile. And the mobile phone, as you know it, have evolved right from this brick to something along like this today. And this is the iPhone 11 Pro Bubble Tea. Bubble. Okay, I don't know. Some people won't like this comment. But whatever it is, it's the iPhone 11 Pro Max. And that's the smartphone. And that's where we are today. It's really a smartphone because it's more than a phone. It does everything. It does from weather, from text messages, to pictures, to videos, to anything. The smartphone today is really impressive if you think about it from a historical perspective, the ability to communicate in the way we are able to. So this is just to zoom out a little bit to show you how both transportation and communication have really changed across the years. And without these, right, without transportation, without communication, you think about it, how would you be able to have a business, maybe to liaise with your supplier over in India, and then the assembly line in Vietnam, and then the HQ in Singapore, and then the consumer base in the US? How are you going to do that? You wouldn't be able to. So these are enablers, factors that enable, make possible globalization, right? But just because we have the ability doesn't mean we must pursue globalization. So there is this aspect of willingness as well. We can have all the technology at hand, but if we're not willing to, why would globalization unfold? It wouldn't. So you have to ask yourselves, to whom does globalization benefit? And what are some of the pros and cons of globalization? And that will answer the aspect of willingness. So actually, Ms. Chen in her lecture on the pros and cons of trade have already covered this quite in detail. You can go back and review her lecture on what are some of the benefits and costs of international trade and also protectionism, right? So much of this is kind of repeated, but we want to recap the key ideas, right? So from the firm's perspective, there are benefits of globalization. And if you were to just pause and recall, what is the firm's primary objective? Is to maximize profits, right? So when we talk about profits, there are two aspects as well. There's revenue, and then there's costs. So to the firm is asking, if I pursue globalization, will I increase my revenue and will I decrease my costs? Or will my revenue increase even though my cost may increase, but my revenue increase to a larger extent? So the idea is this: if a firm has the ability to increase its profits with globalization, then likely that firm will want to pursue globalization. Okay, so there are some arguments you can make where globalization can help increase the revenue of firms, right? So expanding abroad to enter new markets, and these new markets are international markets. So, and this is especially so for the firms in Singapore, where our domestic market, Singapore, how many people? 6 million. So even if every Singaporean buys one of your product, at most you're going to sell maybe 6 million items, right? Compared to if you were to produce in some bigger country like China, 1 billion, you see the drastic difference, right, in the consumer base. So this is often a very big reason why some firms are looking to expand out, right, to have a larger market base, international market base, and hopefully increase their revenue. And of course, there are also arguments where globalization can help reduce the costs of firms, right? So offshoring, as you've already learned in your market structure, so if you want to, you can also take this opportunity to revise your micro concepts. Okay, offshoring allows firms to possibly lower their costs of production. And if in turn, that would help them to maximize their profits, right? If A good way to revise across topics, so here when we're doing globalization, is also to ask what then are the explicit links to market structure. How do I have a graph for this? Can I draw a graph for this? And how about the analysis in terms of cost, revenue, concepts? I challenge you not just to attend this video and then gloss past this as globalization, but to start linking topics, because that's exactly how the A-level examiners like to examine set papers now, right? They link from globalization, which is a macro issue, with your micro issue. All right, and you can also understand the willingness from the government's perspective. Why would governments across the world want to pursue globalization? Well, often there are some benefits. So, engine of economic growth and improving standards of living. Really, the framework is this. Government seeks to maximize the standard of living of the citizens in its country. And in doing so, they pursue the 4 macro aims. So does globalization help to achieve this objective? If it does, then that's really a benefit of globalization. The government would be happy to pursue it. If not, then maybe the government may not be so supportive of globalization after all. And you can see some trade negotiations and agreements forged between countries possibly can help to bring down trade, investment, and mitigation barriers. You can try your best to link this to how that will affect your X, possibly affect your M, that might affect your balance of trade, might affect your AD, might affect your economic growth, and especially for sectors that are highly dependent on trade, how would that affect your employment? Another of the benefits from the government's perspective is really to help firms. If I'm able to help my firms expand abroad and as a result increase their profits that they can make, what will this result in? Higher average household income for my residents, right? And you can link this to C, you can link this to I, and then you can link this to the AD, and again, the analysis link it to real national income and economic growth. So you must understand issues, whether or not it's globalization or any other issue, when they are asked in the context of the government, you have to understand what the government's main objective is. Okay, so when we are tackling macro style questions, then the main objective of the government is to maximize the standard of living and also the 4 macro aims as a result of maximizing the standard of living, right? So all the issues that you are citing, in this case globalization, have to be linked back to economic growth, employment, balance of trade, and price stability through the ADAS model. Right, that will come under economic analysis. So don't forget to link whatever issue you are explaining back to the key focus, which is the government's 4 macroeconomic aims.